Hello YouTube, Sidekick here with another installment of the Iron Bomber's Guide to the DCS Galaxy, although today is going to be a pretty basic edition. Today I just want to talk about landing in DCS, and to be clear, this is going to be just about the most basic tutorial on landing aircraft in DCS that I could make. It's going to be designed for players new to DCS and really to players new to high-fidelity flight simulation, and who don't really have any real-world flying experience. If that's you, keep watching. If that's not you, well, feel free to watch and contribute your own comments, but realize I'm not trying to teach you how to do something you don't already know how to do. I wanted to make this video because after I made my last video on the USS Forrestal, someone pointed out that I was doing some pretty basic things that I was not really explaining when I was flying the approach and landing to the carrier. So that got me thinking that there actually aren't a lot of videos out there that just explain the very basics of landing an aircraft, much less landing the high-performance aircraft that you find in DCS. So today, I'm just going to talk about landing. We're not going to talk about circuits, or patterns, or approaches. We're not going to talk about how to use instruments to line yourself up. We're just going to talk about what to do once you're lined up on the runway. Don't get me wrong, you still need to know how to get yourself lined up, or none of this is going to be of any use at all to you, but today, we're just going to start with a little mission where all the airplanes are lined up on the runway at Batumi. They're all about 12 nautical miles out from the threshold, and they're all at 4,000 feet, which means they're around the right altitude for a standard final. For this video, I'm going to do the final approach in a few different aircraft just to show what is different and what stays the same. I'm going to start in one of the easiest aircraft to land, at least for my money, and that's the A-29. And then I'm going to work my way up to what I think can be a little bit more challenging aircraft to land, well, anyways, and that's the A-4. Now, none of them are really hard to land once you know and practice some simple techniques, but the A-4 is just a bit less forgiving, and it gives you less information to help you fly the approach. So, to start with, let's just go to the whiteboard and really quickly get some of the basics sorted out. Landing an aircraft is really just a matter of getting the aircraft to the spot on the ground where you want it, while also flying at a speed that is, effectively, as slow as the airplane will fly and still be stable and controllable. It's making both of these things happen at the same time. That's the challenge. The challenge arises because if we fly too slow, the airplane's wings will suddenly stall, which means that they will lose lift and the airplane will stop flying and start falling. When this happens close to the ground, it's a bad thing. Now, the simple way of talking about stalling is to talk about a stall speed, and that's how I just described it, in fact. But the truth is that the real flight parameter that controls whether a wing stalls is something called the angle of attack. This is just the pilot term for the angle between the airflow over the wing and the wing itself. As this angle increases, the lift generated by the wing actually increases, until the point where the wing stalls, and then lift is lost entirely. So, when we're landing, what we're trying to do is to find the sweet spot where the lift is maximum, but before we hit the stall point. Since there is usually a pretty direct relationship between angle of attack and speed, we often just calculate a stall speed. But more sophisticated military jets increasingly use an instrument in the cockpit that actually displays the angle of attack while you're landing. This indicator will tell you if your angle of attack is too high or too low, and the challenge then becomes getting the angle of attack just right at the same time as you aim for the right spot on the runway. Pilots are taught a very simple system for doing that. Every new pilot is taught that on landing approach, speed and angle of attack is controlled by the pitch of the nose and the landing spot is controlled by the power. This can be a little backwards to the way you normally fly. Normally you add or reduce power to speed up or slow down, and you pitch up or down to aim at a different point. Well, when you're landing, you do the opposite. And that's what takes a little bit of getting used to. So let's go out and see what that looks like in the cockpit. So here we are in the A-29. Pick the A-29 because it's a good combination of being pretty easy to land, but also having a modern HUD with a lot of the symbology that we're going to be using in other aircraft. Now, the first thing we're doing, we're pointed at the runway, as you can see. The flight path vector there in the middle of the HUD shows us where the plane is going, and we're keeping that near the base of the runway. We're slowing down because it's important to get below the gear and flap operating speed, before we put down the gear and the flaps. And we're there now, so we're putting them down. Now, you see that a new symbol has appeared on the HUD. This is called the staple. This is our angle of attack indicator in the A-29. We need to keep the flight path vector inside the staple, preferably right in the middle of it, for our angle of attack to be acceptable for landing. So I'm trimming the aircraft to get the flight path vector in the middle of the staple, but as you can see, now we're aimed quite low. So what I'm going to have to do is add power, a significant amount of power, to get the flight path vector coming up. And it's slowly coming up. Now it's past the point where we want it, so now we'll have to kill the power. And it's going to start coming back down. So the trick is to just start jockeying the power, really leaving pitch alone, believe it or not. And the flight path vector is going to stay in the middle of the staple if we're trimmed right. And it's just a matter of jockeying the power to get the flight path vector aimed where we want it to be at the end of the runway, and then keeping it there. So maybe we need to trim a little bit down to get the flight path vector more in the middle of the staple. Jockey the power off a little bit, aim more at the beginning of the runway. And then hopefully what we're doing is, as we're getting closer, we're just making finer and finer adjustments. So you can see the elevator's not really moving. I'm not changing the pitch. I'm really just changing the power, and that's actually changing where the nose is pointed. So we're using the power to change our landing spot, which is indicated by the flight path vector, and we're keeping the flight path vector inside the staple by being trimmed correctly. So we're not having to touch the pitch, we're just changing the power. So you can watch the power dial down there, the TQ percent dial, and you can see that it's pretty much constantly moving around as I'm trying to jockey it to get the flight path vector where I want it. Now, even in the A-29 is pretty responsive, but even in the A-29 there's a bit of lag, and that's partly why you need to keep doing this jockeying. This effect is going to get more and more pronounced as we go through the various jets. But with the A-29, it's pretty simple. Once we got ourselves stabilized, we're just doing small jockeying with the power to keep the flight path vector right where we want it, and we're just sliding down the rope to the runway. Now, of course, this will be harder if there's wind or crosswind or anything, but in simple conditions, in the simplest possible landing configuration, this is about all there is to it. Get yourself trimmed out so the flight path vector is in the middle of the angle of attack staple, so you know you've got a good angle of attack. I'm not watching the speed, I'm just watching the staple. I'm just watching where the flight path vector is aimed, because that's where we're going to try and flare, and then we'll touch down a little bit beyond that point. I'm keeping that nice and safe. It's a little bit beyond the numbers, but it's close to the point, around the point where I think we're going to need to flare, so we touch down where the the black stuff starts, and we're going to keep it in the middle of the runway, and we just keep it where we want it with power. Once we know we've made the runway, we can back off the power and start our flare, and we're just going to try and hold the aircraft off the ground until it touches down, and we are down and home. Okay, that's landing in the A-29, turboprop, pretty simple, nice HUD. Let's go try it in an aircraft that's a bit more of a challenge, because it's a jet, but it doesn't have a HUD. So this is the C-101, that has the annoying tendency of giving you a tone when you back off the power before you drop the gear. So let's just drop the gear here to get the tone to go off. And now that sound you hear in the background that sounds like a tone is actually not one. It's actually just me raising the trim. If you look to the left of the cockpit, you can actually see a trim gauge. The trick with the C-101 is that we're basically going to land with the trim eventually all the way to the maximum. And that's pretty much how we gauge the right angle of attack. Is if you're flying with the trim all the way maximum, then you're probably about right. So you'll also notice that I have the controls up in this jet on the left, so you'll be able to track what I'm doing. You can see that the power is all the way off, the gear is down, the flaps are coming down. And you can see that I'm still pulling back on the trim. Now, the trick with the C-101 is it doesn't have a HUD, and until you've flown it for a while, you don't realize that the proper horizon line in the C-101 is very high in the cockpit, almost at the top of the mirror. So it's very easy to come in too high on the C-101 by putting the runway too low in the cockpit. If you put it where you would for a normal jet, it'll be high every time. So I really want the runway to be above the GPS box there, about halfway between the top of the GPS box and the top of the mirror. In my experience, is about right. So I'm letting the nose come down, and now it's probably lower than I want it to be, so I'm adding power. You can see the throttle going there on the left. Adding a little bit more power. As I said, experience has shown me that the C-101 will fool me every time and make me feel like I am right on, and then I will be quite high. And it also floats pretty well after you rotate, so you don't want to be afraid to feel like you're low in the C-101. Although I can tell you from experience, it can be overdone. So you'll notice that we have maxed out the up trim. It's at the bottom of the scale now. So this is what we're going to use to control the speed, and it's at about 130 miles an hour. And that's pretty much what we're going to approach at. And so now, same as the A-29 was, I'm really only using the power. Not touching the stick, except maybe to keep myself lined up. Trim's all the way back, so we're not messing with that anymore. And if I feel like I'm too low, which I feel a little bit like I'm too low, I'm just adding power. Adding power to bring the nose up. Now the C-101 is pretty responsive. The nose moves up and down with power pretty responsively compared to, as you'll see, the T-45 is not bad, but the A-4 is really a bit of a handful when it comes to that. So again, now it's making me nervous. I'm feeling like I'm too low. I'm probably not. Probably going to end up going high, but I'm adding power because, well, long is better than short when you're landing. So once again, just trying to keep that runway coming straight at me, not moving up or down in the cockpit. If it's moving down in the cockpit, you're too high. If it's moving up in the cockpit, you're too low. We're just trying to keep that black smudge about in the same spot in the cockpit, jockeying the power up and down to keep it about where I want it. Jockeying the power a little bit. Trying to resist the temptation to pull up because I feel like I'm too low in this aircraft. Watching that smudge, I want it right in the middle of the cockpit. Don't want it going up or down. Don't want it going up and down. As you can see, we're going to be a little high. As per usual with the C-101, but not too bad compared to some of my landings in the C-101. And then we just need to time the flare and realize that it's going to float, and don't over-rotate. And hold her off, and hold her off. And down. And we're home and dry in the C-101. Alright, so let's take a look at a slightly more advanced jet, although still a trainer, and this is the T-45. Now, the benefit of the T-45 is that it does have full HUD symbology, and it also has an angle of attack indicator, which is something that you'll see particularly in U.S. airplanes. Now, unfortunately, in this mod, the controls indicator don't seem to work, so I can't bring them up, so we'll just have to describe what we're doing here. It's the same basic procedures we used in all the other aircraft, except now we also have a new flight control, the speed brakes. So we've deployed the speed brakes, and that is making our speed drop precipitously. Part of the reason that we add the speed brakes in the T-45 and later in the A-4 is because it means we can actually operate the engine at higher RPMs. And the engine is more efficient and more responsive at high RPMs, so we actually want that extra drag from the speed brakes so we can make the engine work a little harder, and it makes it actually a little easier to do the landing. So we're using pretty much the same procedure as we have all along. We've slowed the aircraft down. We're going to get the flight path vector on the end of the runway. Now we're putting the gear down. Now, once the gear comes down, we're going to get an angle of attack staple. There it is. And we're also going to get the angle of attack indicator, which is showing up on the left-hand side of the HUD. See, the staple went way up past the flight path vector. That's because I was also dropping the flaps, and that's what tends to happen. So now what we need to do is slowly move the flight path vector up to the staple. And when we do, you'll see the red inverted V at the bottom of the angle attack indicator will turn to a yellow circle. So we're just doing the same thing we've done each time. I'm actually just using pitch trim to get my flight path vector into the AOA staple and get the AOA staple to the middle. And then I'm using power to put the angle, the flight path vector at the base of the runway. There's a little bit of interaction between the staple and the power. I'm not touching pitch. I'm just leaving it trimmed out. It's going to move around a little bit, depending on how aggressively I use the power. So the trick is not to be too aggressive with the power, and then we'll keep the flight path vector in the middle of the AOA staple, and we'll keep the AOA lights in the middle. And other than that, it's pretty much the same technique that we used on the other jets. I'm just jocking the power up and down a little, trying to get that flight path vector right at the base of the runway where I want to land. And it'd probably be good if I got it on the runway instead of beside the runway. As you see, again, when I'm jockeying a little more aggressively, we get a little bit of movement of the AOA indicator. And we're just sort of hunting around for the right spot now. Now, generally, I find with the T-45, it's okay to aim a little short and then bring the power on near the end, because it's pretty responsive. And that essentially, one thing, I don't remember to put an anti-skid on, or this thing is impossible to stop on the runway. Okay, just a sec, let's get ourselves lined up again. As I was saying, I don't mind being a little under with the T-45, and then coming up to the runway with a little bit of power right at the end. Kind of reduces the sink rate. Not sure I'd do that on a carrier landing, but it works on land landings. So we're adding a little bit of power now to keep the flight path vector up on the runway. And we'll just come on with a little bit of power right here at the end. Your sink rate starts to fall a little bit. And with a Navy jet, are designed to really just go straight into the runway and not really do a flare. Find it hard to avoid doing at least a little bit of a flare at the end, but that's not what you need to do. And now, like I said, it's a little bit of a rodeo stopping the T-45, but nothing as bad as the A-4, which is what we're going to try next. So the A-4 is the ultimate challenge of these four aircraft because it doesn't have the HUD symbology of the T-45, and it's even less responsive in terms of engine. Because it's not a trainer aircraft. It was an aircraft that was designed to fly fast and be nimble, and so really trying to make it fly slow and be stable is taking out of its comfort zone. You're going to hear a lot of clunks and bumps as the slats deploy and as the flaps deploy, and it's also pretty noisy on landing, which is just a testament to the high-quality sound model, but it's still a little disconcerting the first time you experience it. So we're holding the nose above the runway. I know from experience that I want the runway at the bottom of the sight for landing, and waiting for the speed to come down, just because we don't want to deploy the speed brakes any earlier than we have to, but we're going to deploy the speed brakes here pretty soon just so we can get the engine back up. into its sweet spot. Above 80% is really where this engine wants to perform. Jet engines don't like to be at idle. So now we're bringing the power up, keeping the speed from falling too far. We need to be under 200 for the gear, so now we'll put the gear down. And once the gear's down, we'll start down with the flaps. Now, we do have an AOA indicator in the A4, but we don't have the staple. We don't have a flight path vector, so this makes it a little bit more of a challenge. So I'm just bringing trim back, slowly, and trying to get the AOA indicator in the middle, which is about there. And now we start jocking the power because we're too low. So we're going to give it a little bit of power, start moving it up. And then we'll continue to adjust that AOA vector, mostly with trim, not moving the stick too much, although there's a little bit more coupling in the A4, so it's a little hard to be quite as much off the stick as you are in the other aircraft, at least I find. So you can see on the left on the controls that I am moving the throttle a fair bit, more than in the other aircraft, because this engine just doesn't respond as quickly, and honestly, I still need to do work, get better at flying the A4, get more used to that engine and exactly how much thrust I need. But we got the AOA indicator pretty much locked solid in the middle, and we've just done that with trim, and it will go up and down a little bit, but it shouldn't go too far out, and we just have to keep jocking the power, keep the runway there just above, a little bit too far now. Now we're coming off a little bit. And this is the problem, is you really don't want to get into, as they call it, pilot-induced oscillations, which I'm in danger of doing here, or just going too far on either side of neutral. It's really just a matter of getting used to exactly how much power you need to get the nose coming up and down as much as you want it to. And it's something I need to practice a little bit more, but this is the basic idea. And there's the 500-foot tone. Not doing too badly. But you got to be careful here right at the end. It is really possible to get complacent, let the nose drop, and then you get into trouble. And as you can see, that's kind of where we are. Looks like we're going to be a little long, or maybe not. Hold it off, and I'm flaring just a little bit. And not a bad landing for the A4. A little left to center. Now the A4 has truly atrocious brakes, and so you will need to make sure that you do not use up too much of your runway if you want to stop in time at the end. Alright, that is the very basic landing tutorial in DCS. And as I pop the canopy here and careen down the runway at Batumi, I hope that has been useful for all of you out there who are newer to DCS and a little bit perplexed by how landing works in these high-performance aircraft. Don't forget, landing in one of these aircraft is a little bit of an unnatural act. These aircraft are designed to go fast and to be unstable, and when you try to make them go slow and fly them stably as you're trying to land, you are asking them to perform outside of their normal performance envelope. So don't be surprised if it takes a lot of effort. But I think if you practice and if you know the techniques, that it's not something that is difficult to master, but I think it does take some practice. Anyways, I'm obviously going to need some more, so I'm going to go back out and try again. But for now, this is Sidekick, signing off.